we made this.
Welcome to the Starlight Ballroom. Hey!
Welcome to Shipwrecked Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast only on the We Made This Podcast network. I'm neither Kurt or Mark. I'm Matt. I'm the good-looking one, back again, hosting in the hosting chair, and in the hosting what? It's alright. It's only been like a few seconds. I've already ballsed this up.
That joke is better than anything in the comedy series we are about to discuss. The good-looking one.
Oh. Man, that's the best compliment you've ever given me. Yes, and the sweet talker across the internet from me is Tony Black. How you doing, Tony?
Hello, Matthew. I'm. It didn't sound like him at all, did it? It's getting worse. I'm good, mate. I'm good. It's a pleasure to be back on the premier Red Dwarf podcast online. Not talking about Red Dwarf. Yay!
Yay! Yes,
that's not a yay that it's Red Dwarf's bad, by the way. It's a yay that it's just such an anachronism that you get me on a podcast to discuss, a podcast about a show I've never seen to discuss something else. I quite love it, really.
I'm gonna say, have you not watched any Red Dwarf yet? Still,
not yet. It's on the list. I have seen the odd episode, to be fair, but it's on the list, the ever-growing list that is never, ever, ever going down because there's too much TV. Times are confusing.
and you waste your time making podcasts about it, and that's why.
Yeah, this is it. If I stop podcasting, I'd actually get to watch Red Dwarf.
Yeah, I mean, if it's like, yeah, guys, like, oh, do I watch Red Dwarf or do I watch Severance for the 14th time? I don't know.
Well, you know the answer to that one, but there you go.
But yes, we're here to carry on our chat with the Brits now, with the Brittas Empire. We're talking with the anthropomorphic representation of the TV show itself. No, talking about the Brittas Empire, which is the show that ran for 7 series between, I think, 1991 to 1997 on BBC, starring a guy called Chris Barrie, who, if you watch Red Dwarf, you might recognise the name. So we've already spoke about Series 1 and we spoke about Series 2. We've talked about the genesis of the characters, and we're now getting to the point where I think the show is starting to get slightly quite popular, and I think more popular than I think Red Dwarf ever got on the mainstream. I think I made that point in the past, but I think we're starting to get towards, I think, a period of the show where we're reaching its high point, I think.
It's a bit mad, though, isn't it? Don't you think it's a bit mad, though, that might well be the case on a technical perspective, but there is no way with... I mean, obviously, Red Dwarf is technically still going, and still is doing new episodes, but there's no way that the Brittas Empire now is better remembered or better considered than Red Dwarf 20, 30 odd years later. Yet at the time, it was much more successful. I think that's fascinating, really.
Yeah, and I think, and again, it's been a while since we've spoke. I can't remember the last when the Series 2 chat happened. It was at least a year ago. I think that was 1746
we did that.
Yeah. Because I remember, like, I think Ricky Gervais heard it and then thought, "Ooh, podcast." But I think one of the things we're saying was on about, because we've spoken about the kind of mainstream appeal of it, if I remember rightly, and how it contrasts with kind of the cult niche following of Red Dwarf, where it's quite interesting where you've got kind of cult, not fully mainstream characters that can kind of carry on past like a usual series length, whereas you've got like a flash in the pan, like 7-year stint of a Brittas Empire, where it which is kind of like very 90s and very isolated, whereas you've got certain characters and stories that will kind of like have a legacy. So like, again, I think I'm not going to speak too much about David Brent's again, but David Brent's a character that kind of travels and like kind of evolves as he gets older. And the prime example I always go to is Alan Partridge. Partridge is someone who like dips in and out of mainstream, but seems to work as he gets older as an actual character who feels like an actual person, whereas like, for example, the show like the Brittas Empire is very much kind of like flash in the pan, like has a kind of shelf life, a start, a middle, and an end, which is something we're very interested when we get to the actual end to talk about. But you can't really see the character kind of evolving past that. Whereas you got like characters like Alan Partridge, and again the Red Dwarf characters and the premise itself kind of able to kind of evolve as they age.
Yeah, but and that's the difference. Brittas it's like you say, it is wedged in the 90s in so many different ways, while at the same time being really indebted to, I'd say honestly, I'd say the 70s probably more than anything else in terms of the kind of sitcom it is, really. So it's of its time, and it's also of the past in terms of sitcom, relatability, I guess, in terms of style, but it's not of the future, really. So it's a bit more of an artifact, and I think that's kind of where it's remained, and I think that's something that we'll probably come back to whenever we do these, for each of the remaining few seasons. In that, it's never really going to evolve beyond this 6-year run or whatever it was. So yeah, it's very, very interesting, really. But I do think this is definitely the season where, like you say, it starts to figure out what the show actually is, and starts to become the show. I think if someone like yourself, who's a pretty big legacy Brittas fan, and I think it's probably this season, as I was watching it, I was thinking this is probably the point where someone like Latham would have gone, oh, I like this, with what it was doing.
Yeah, and I think this is probably like around the time where my first memories of the show, watching it. I think I can kind of remember, because I remember watching it as a child, and kind of remember it being on TV and watching it. And I think Series 3 is probably round that time. I can remember properly the first episodes I remember watching. I can't remember any specific memories or moments, but I definitely do have memories of this, and particularly I think a few things in Series 1 and 2 I kind of have I had memories of, even though I watched the DVDs when I first bought them ages ago. Series 3, I think, as well, was one of the first. I remember rewatching this and going, oh yeah, this is the episode where this happens, and yeah, so this is, so I think a lot of what I remember from the Brittas Empire being, I think a lot of it started from this series onwards. So again, I'm getting into slightly more familiar territory now. But so for context, Series 3 aired in 1993, and Series 3 ran from the 7th of January all the way to the 11th of February. And to put that into context of Red Dwarf, Red Dwarf Series 5 finished in March of 1992, and then, as explained in our previous episodes, Mark and Kurt went into the behind the scenes stuff about why Red Dwarf 6 ended up coming out in October rather than March of 1993. So at the moment, there's a good 18-month lull of no Red Dwarf at this point. So this is your Chris Barrie fix, to put it into those terms. And Series 3, quite an eventful series, particularly for Gordon Brittas. I kind of want to ask whether it is for any of the characters, but we'll get into that. So we have Brittas on trial. There's a rival leisure centre having a day trip. There's a poisonous spider. We meet Gordon's twin brother, and we learn a lot more about Laura. And then there's also another pregnancy, another childbirth, which is a trope the show seems to quite like for some reason. But I think what we'll probably do, we're going to briefly go through Series 3, because we're not going to really go. We've been through the kind of characters as a genesis, but I think particularly for Series 3 at the moment, we'll probably just go through and briefly spend about 5-10 minutes on each episode. So we open up with the trial, which features Brittas on trial for a massacre of a load of Bolivian drug dealers, and bodily harm to a bunch of OAPs, as well as drug running, and involves the Demon Headmaster and Billy Mitchell from
it does.
I think Terence Hardiman, is it Terence Hardiman? Plays the prosecutor. And to be fair, if Terence Hardiman was basically accusing me of anything because of the fact that he traumatised me as a child as the Demon Headmaster, a show that I loved, I would just plead guilty to anything he would have told me. So the trial. So I really liked the first episode. I thought there's a couple of interesting things in comparison to the rest of the series I want to bring up in a sec, but I quite liked how this was like set up, how a lot of basically Chekhov's guns were set up, everything kind of led up and converged brilliantly, and I think this is probably one of the strongest, if not funny, in terms of structure and setting up and how a British sitcom should be. I think technically this is one of the strongest episodes of this series so far. What did you think of this one?
I thought it was striking as an opener, because it's like you said, it's playing with structure and it's experimenting a bit more, and it's always that whole thing, isn't it? When you get a couple of seasons in, sitcoms start to play around a little bit more, and so do dramas in many ways, but they sort of have that confidence and that freedom. Now they're established to sort of start turning things around a little bit more, and this is where it sets its stall out, both from the structural perspective of telling the story in flashbacks, putting Brittas in a situation where he's on trial for multiple murders, and and that's the thing, we're laughing because this is really the episode that doubles down on what was really striking across season 3 in how much it does. It jumps. If the first couple of seasons dip their toe in the absurd, the trial and subsequent episodes just barrel full on into the water with this, because this starts with the mild-mannered, technocrat manager of a leisure centre on trial for killing mass Bolivian drug dealers. Now, that in itself is bonkers, right? And the fact that, so many shows, particularly sitcoms, they don't murder masses of people. In this series, you have this literally has him like climbing over bodies that lying dead with a chainsaw and cutting through the door of a man who's behind the door and then cutting his head off. Basically, this doesn't happen in most sitcoms. In most sitcoms, people don't get mass murdered. There's another episode later on where he basically, Colin accidentally electrocutes a bunch of people in the I think there's a line that sort of suggests they're not dead, or it sort of suggests, most of the time these people are stunned, but they're carrying what look like dead bodies out of the water, and it's really macabre, and it's really twisted, and it's the first time that Brittas has sort of abandoned all sense of reality. This is the episode where it goes, this is bonkers. Like this, let's just not pretend that this is any kind of normal reality, and let's have it be that Bolivian drug dealers can get mass murdered in this leisure centre. Fine. And I think I liked it for that. I liked it for that reason. So and that's a definite change from the last 2 seasons.
Yeah, and again, I think there are absurd things that happen. I've got vivid memories of even more absurd things that push the boundaries of just like cartoonish like things in later series. And it kind of starts, it finds its sweet spot, and that sweet spot is kind of like black humour, but not black. It somehow manages to remain light, kind of BBC One 8:30 entertainment, but feel like it should be airing at 9:30 on Channel 4, but has the feel of an half 8 Thursday evening sitcom instead of a Friday.
It's odd. It's not keeping up appearances. It's not a safe sitcom in that way. That you would have had on mainstream BBC One in the early 90s. It's not that. it's very clearly absurdist and surrealist, but like you say, it is weird because it never tips too heavily into alternative comedy, and it never goes too dark, and at the same time you can still buy that you've got all of these fairly light, because that's the thing with Brittas, and this season really sort of sells that. It is both a classic sort of Fawlty Towers, Are You Being Served-esque, slightly camp sitcom on the one hand, and yet on the other, it is doing the kind of stuff, that kind of madcap hyper-realism that you were seeing the comedy, the comic strip guys doing. You know, Rick Mail, Ade Edmondson, those kind of guys at the same time who were, you know, chainsawing, you know, each other's testicles or whatever, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's doing that a little bit, but it's also doing it within the province of a safe BBC sitcom. And not many, in fact, Brittas might be an anomaly in that way, because I can't really think of many other examples that do that at this time in 1993.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I never thought about the bottom comparison or the kind of like not 9 o'clock news style of alternative comedy with your Ben Elton kind of stuff, because I don't think that didn't get as dark. But again, I think that it's channel, like I keep, my mind keeps going back to Channel 4, where like, and I think Channel 4 didn't probably, I don't know, Channel 4 probably didn't go as dark or as...
Well, what was the most popular Channel 4 comedy around this time? I'd put money on it being Desmond's. Yeah, exactly. Right. Desmond's didn't do anything like this. Desmond's was basically the Cosby Show for Brits, essentially. So it was, you know, it was a different kind of thing, you know. Whereas Channel 4 was, I know what you mean though, because it was Channel 4's comedy, and the alternative factor was often the late night edgy kind of stuff, you know, The Word,
before later,
that kind of thing. And they were doing, you know, edgy sitcoms and things like that. But it was, I know what you're saying. I think it's a mesh of a lot of this stuff. But I do think it's bit. And there's one episode later on that's particularly indebted to it. I still think its biggest inspiration is Fawlty Towers, without a shadow of a doubt. And I think Fagan and Norris, who write the show, are 100% digging into that well. But that I'll talk about that in a bit more. Yeah.
The last thing I just want to mention about this opener as well is that I think it's what's very well done. I think it's also very clever in terms of how you could easily have this as being the first episode that someone will watch, because what's quite clever is that whenever you got a flash forward back to the trial itself, it's always another member of the ensemble, and they do get their own kind of in-character moment, which, like, one, reminds you of who these characters are, and two, is like an introduction to them. So you've got kind of like Tim, like, not really liking Brittas. You've got kind of Gavin being on the fence. You got Colin. You got Colin's kind of like unwavering loyalty. You've got Linda's naive view of Brittas as well, and everything like that. So there's and very interestingly, you've got Helen who and this is the bit I find interesting. I think this episode is also the last time we see the very unsubtle hints that she's cheating on or she's having an affair, because with Uncle Simon, because like there's a bit where he's like saying, "Oh, where'd you buy the coat?" and the Mercedes, because that suddenly vanishes. I can't recall anything like that being referenced again later in the series. So I'm wondering whether this is the last time we kind of, because I think we've spoken about Helen and kind of like the affair, like the affair subplot at length, and this feels like it's carrying that. But then there's something happens between this and episode 2 where I can't recall any kind of joke or hint that Helen's actually cheating on Gordon anymore. It's just she's like trapped. She's like trapped in a world of her around us and Gordon, and I'm kind of wondering at what point did they decide to suddenly just drop that aspect of a character, because it's very, very jarring when you rewatch it.
I don't know. I think with Helen they leaned a lot into Pippa Haywood's histrionics performance. I think they realised there was that nervous energy in her, that madness, and I think they just went down that road, really. And maybe they also realised that she was becoming quite unsympathetic, because there's a definite gear change in this series with her, completely. She does become a lot more, balmy, really, and she edges more towards that. By the end of the vivid memories I have of her, it's not what we saw in series 1 and 2. It was basically a woman who just runs in every week, looking like her hair's gone through a Van de Graaff machine, going, "Oh, Gordon!" Like that's the Helen I remembered, and that was it stuck in my head, and that gets progressively more, acute as time goes on, and you start to see that a bit more here, I think.
Yeah, and you know what? I'll bring this up when we get to a later episode because I think it works well for Helen's character. If we move to number 2 is the creeping feeling, which involves a deadly tropical spider, and pretty much the rest of the cast. And I've never heard anyone use this term apart from this of Gordon Brittas being sent to Coventry. Now, have you ever been to Coventry?
Really? You've never heard that term before?
I've never heard of it apart from here. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a common term, being sent to Coventry. Yeah, and do you know what it means?
Is it just like blanking someone out, or?
Yeah, but I think there's a particular. It's a particular idiom that there's a reason that it's used. It's about ostracising, and it goes back all the way to the English Civil War. Believe it or not, I am googling. Okay. Yes, I am googling. Where and basically, this is what it says: Coventry was a parliamentary stronghold, and the king's soldiers were so hated that royalist prisoners were sent to Coventry, where it was felt they would be ignored. So that then became a term. Oh, he's been sent to Coventry, and I'm surprised as a Midlander you've never heard that term particularly, because that's
no, never have.
Oh wow, yeah. Well, but he really uses that in this, doesn't he? Oh, I've been sent to Coventry. The whole staff are sending me to Coventry. So if you don't know the term, you're going to go, "What's he on about?"
Yeah. Well, the thing is, he doesn't even know he's been sent to Coventry until Laura explicitly tells him. But yeah, this is also where. Also,
Coventry isn't a place you'd want to be sent to anyway. So it works on both levels.
Yeah, it's apparently is it still the current city of culture?
Is it?
Yeah, wow. I think so. Yeah. They had the Radio 1's big weekend was there.
Okay. No, that's Bradford now, isn't it? Isn't it Bradford?
It's Bradford. I think Bradford's scheduled to be the city of culture in 2025 or something, something like that. It's like it's like Bradford's got like 3 years to get cultured.
Well, if just to finish, Coventry's slogan should be "At least we're not Stoke." That should be what it says. Really, because Stoke is way worse. Anyway, sorry, we've just alienated all of Stoke and Coventry, so apologies everyone.
Yeah, don't worry. Just I'm closer to Coventry than you are, so you just feel.
You'll be the one who's sent there. Yeah.
But yeah, this is kind of like almost Brittas by numbers, but Brittas by numbers where you've got an external person come in. This time being a psychiatrist played by I did have the actor's name. No, Andrew Hilton, who I had a quick look, and he's a fully fledged Shakespearean actor.
Well, he has a great voice. Like I kept thinking all the way through, I bet he's done tons of adverts and voiceover work because he has a really great, rich voice. So I'm really not surprised he's a Shakespearean actor. Yeah.
Yeah, he's the man. I had a quick look, and like he's done as many as like Ian McKellen and stuff. So he's one of these theatre actors who's got like a sort of sense of gravitas, and perhaps just never got that kind of like push that McKellen or Stewart's ever got and stuff.
It doesn't help that he looks a bit like John Major, So that's gonna be a problem. But there you go. He was never gonna be headlining Top Gun Maverick, was he? Let's face it.
Yeah. This again another kind of episode that I quite liked. Again, it was used in the case to with the anxiety levels, kind of predictable, but kind of predictable kind of jokes. But it's very similar to other earlier episodes in early series where, like, for example, you had the trainer the
Yeah,
the motivational speaker to
I
speak
know.
to the staff. And what I found quite interesting now was this was someone who didn't really get wound up. He was someone who it was kind of got under the skin of Brittas and kind of kept his cool. Where there's in previous series, it was someone who was easily wound up. I was quite surprised at how much the psychiatrist actually got to him at a certain point. Anyway.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, it's a slightly unusual approach, and it's done alongside like you say, it's a fairly traditional sitcom format idea. You introduce a bit of a, it's that classic. You introduce something. I mean, and quite often a creature will be used, won't it? Like a big spider or a snake, or something like that. And nobody notices it there, and then they keep picking it up, or it's on the back. In this case, it's on the back of like a clipboard or whatever, and it's. And it's this comically animatronic.
Oh god, yeah,
thing.
it's so fake, it's ridiculous.
It's hilarious. And it's obviously eventually gonna, pop up somewhere or whatever. Doesn't Carol put it in the baby's drawer at one point, in this episode? So
yeah, and there's a whole thing about her being like, goes, oh, blah, blah, being very kind of like very scared of spiders.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a tried and tested sitcom trope, really, isn't it? But then, like you say, on the flip side, you have this quite interesting psychiatrist aspect with Brittas. But again, and that's another little hint to the Fawlty Towers thing, because that's the kind of thing they used to do in that show. You'd put someone in there who would accentuate Basil Fawlty's madness, and that's what you see in this season actually with Brittas at various points. So.
Yeah, definitely. And last thing I probably want to bring up before I move on to the next episode, which is probably a bit more of an interesting one, but I found the kind of like the characterization of the fact that Brittas is a character that will suck poison out of an employee's bum. Interesting.
Well, he's
Brent wouldn't have done that.
No, he wouldn't. No chance.
No.
Brittas is committed to his staff. I'll give him that.
Yeah, but again, I think that kind of gives him a kind of very unique kind of level and difference between Basil and David Brent. And again, I think we've mentioned that Brittas is kind of like a weird mix between Brent and Michael Scott from the US office. But I personally will not. Can you see Basil Fawlty caring about his staff that much? He'd probably be the one poisoning Manuel, wouldn't he?
Yeah, no, you're right there. Yeah, he doesn't quite line up in that way, but in other ways it does. But
yeah, but so the next episode is Laura's Leaving, which I found to be quite an interesting episode about, and one of the few. I think it's one of the few. Aside from perhaps I think episode 5, there's another kind of almost Laura focused one that seems to want to explore what Laura's role is in terms of what her dynamic is with the cast and with Brittas, with the least amount of Julius and John as possible.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I do think this is probably the best episode of the season for me of this series. I think it's either this or The Trial. I think realistically, because this this does that classic thing though of. You try and set up the idea that the most competent person in the whole thing goes away and the place just collapses into pandemonium. That's essentially what this episode is, really. It's that whole idea, and like I say, with this is the episode that really was Fawlty Towers to its core, because in that show, I mean, really, the comparison point to some extent with that show is that Laura is like Polly in Fawlty Towers, who was Basil Fawlty's maid, but she was essentially the one who ran the place because she was the only one with the brain, really, and then all the rest of them. And in this case, Laura is absolutely that person, and you take her away, and then all collapses around everyone. And in this, you have a character who is, and this is the maths teacher who comes in, and he's desperately trying to get a cup of coffee all the way through. He is, without a shadow of a doubt, a Fawlty Towers character through and through. He's quite a posh, imperious man who spends the whole episode getting increasingly irate at the staff around him, at Brittas, at the situation. In this case, battling with a vending machine, having to deal with Carol's rules that she's having to enforce and all this kind of thing, based on what Brittas is saying. And then it builds and builds and builds and builds to the point where he's going, I just want a cup of coffee, or whatever it is. And it's exactly the same. It really reminded me of the guy, I don't know if you've seen the Fawlty Towers episode, with the guy who's just trying to order a gin and tonic for the whole episode. And all through,
I think I might have, but it's been years.
Yeah, it's been years, but it ends with everything's gone to pot, and you think everything's resolved in the episode, and at the very end, this guy walks in and he goes, can I get a gin and tonic, a vodka, and an orange? Basil Fawlty just throws something against the wall and he goes, right, fuck it. And it's hilarious. It's absolutely hilarious. And this is exactly the same. It's in many ways, it's a copy. They've basically taken that whole concept of a character and ported it into the Brittas Empire. And around that, you've got all the different characters getting caught up in it. So, and I'm not saying this as a criticism, because I actually think it's a really good, tried and tested comic formula. Yes, Fawlty Towers does it better, because it is better written and it's sharper than this show. But it really does. It really struck me here, again, how it's blending 1970s sitcom tropes and styles with this absurdism. Although Laura's Leaving is probably the least absurd episode of the season, I would reckon. Would you agree there?
Yeah, and this still, it's probably the least absurd, and this still is the episode where they electrocute a whole bunch of people having a baptism.
Yeah, apart from that, I forgot that was in this one.
Yeah, apart from the baptism and the electrocuting a bunch of.
Yeah, fair enough.
But the key thing I wanted to go through here as well, again, so it kind of signifies what Laura's role as the straight character is. But this is also the episode, I think, where they kind of nail what Helen's character should be. So, where she's kind of isolated, she doesn't, the only person she's kind of trapped in this world of Gordon. And the only time she gets to escape is when she actually visits and talks to people he works with, because she has no other social life. And you can kind of see why they'd written out the next door neighbour for Helen to talk to as an exposition dump for Helen stuff. And again, I'll bring up the Uncle Simon affair. I'll be interested to see if that gets brought up post this series actually. But with that kind of gone, it's the fact that Laura's only kind of escape is basically at the place her husband works, and it's the same person that is Laura. And I think that works so much more for Helen's character. It makes Helen a lot more, if not interesting, it kind of gives her a focus and a reason to fit into the ensemble, whereas previous series, and we've talked about this, where it seems as much as where we see that Brittas does care for his wife, but just doesn't understand or misses cues and lacks empathy for them, I think we have said that at times Helen feels quite unsympathetic. Here, if you cut that away and basically make that what her character is, she's now kind of trapped with someone who she knows cares for her very, very deeply, but is also kind of going start raving mad that her whole world is just basically her husband and children who will eventually just be versions of him, as well as being pregnant with two other versions of him. Yeah.
It's interesting, going back to what you're saying about how they take away, they very much do partner up Helen and Laura in this season, in this series, and they take away and they put them in the place of being each other's, well, certainly Helen's confidant. I think that's a particularly interesting thing, I think, because it's a very clear, it's also a way of getting Helen more into the place itself and having her more involved in, they don't go to Brittas's home in this series. It's all in the leisure centre. And whether that was a choice of set and money, it could have been a cost-saving measure. They do have other sets. Obviously, they have a courtroom in the trial, and there's some exterior stuff that they do. But it feels like maybe they thought that set just wasn't necessary, you know. So it's all about and in a show like this that is based around a particular place, you've got to do as much as you can in the leisure centre, haven't you? So it makes sense to do that as well. So no, it's interesting, yeah.
But yeah, so then we get to Two Little Boys, where we meet Reverend Horatio Brittas, who is played by... Oh, damn it. I had it just...
Your preparation is extremely shoddy, Mr. Latham.
Thank you. I tried. Yes, so, played by Richard Brain, who I kind of recognise... I kind of recognise from a bunch of different things.
Although you wouldn't want to shorten his first name, would you? Do you think he suffered with that? I'd be amazed.
Suffered what? Suffered what? Sorry, I was just calling you Dick Brain. What are you talking about? Sorry. But Richard Brain is someone who's been in he's one of these people who he's not. I don't think he's not been main character in a lot of things in majority of stuff, but he's appeared in. He's one of those faces you'll see in all sorts of things. So for example, he was in a Harry Enfield and Chums as Dick Nice but Thick.
Oh yes, he was.
Yeah.
Good shout. Yeah. Remember that.
It's amazing what you can read on IMDb, Tony. But he's been in a bunch of stuff as well. Loads of stuff. An episode of Minder. He's been in Bodger and Badger. He's been in Miami 7 as the same character in 2 different episodes. He's been in an episode of Goodnight Sweetheart. He's been in Burner's Watch, Chuckle Vision. As time goes by, goodbye Mr. Chips. He was in an episode of Spooks. He was in EastEnders as a funeral director.
You're going to read his whole IMDb to us? Is that what you're going to do?
I'm skipping loads. Yeah, he's how you get there's all those kind of actors that appear all the time who just seem to live in Vancouver and just roll out of bed and into another guest spot into about 100 different TV series, like Mark Sheppard or Roger R. Cross at one point.
He's
the British version of that. He's the British version of Roger R. Cross, except he doesn't have a first wave. Or a continuum to his name, but yeah. So, I mean, credit where credit's due. Credit where credit is due. Don't laugh. I'm gonna have to keep this in.
Sorry, just what was it? Credit where
credit's due.
Okay, there you go. Then please continue.
Yeah, I mean, I'd assume they would have had Chris Barrie play his own twin brother, but I do appreciate that they decided to actually cast someone else, so they're not actually identical, but they are very similar but different in very. They are similar but different as well.
It's an interesting performance because you can tell that. Richard Brain is actively trying to evoke Chris Barrie's portrayal of Brittas. Mm-hmm. There's just a way he's playing it. He's doing that slightly geeky voice thing, but it's a bit off key. So he's not doing a carbon copy of Brittas, because I don't really think you can do a carbon copy of Chris Barrie's voice with this. It is a bit like Steve Coogan and Alan Partridge in that you can get a ton of impersonations and they will never be quite right. They'll never be quite accurate because it's so unique.
It's Eric Cartman. It's Cartman from South Park as well.
Exactly.
Those kind of unique character voices that you really will never get an emulation of.
No, you can't. You'd have to be John Culshaw levels of impressionist good to get anywhere close. So he's not doing that carbon copy, but he's definitely. You can see the DNA. You can understand the. It is weird why they just didn't have Chris Barrie play the same character. It is weird how they just didn't get him to play a second character here. But at the same time, I think the way that Richard Brain plays it, I think he's quite good. And I think he manages to... You can believe he's a Brittas without believing he's exactly the same and he's just copying what Chris Barrie's doing, which I thought was quite good.
And I quite like the fact that he's kind of used to show kind of like that Brittas as a character kind of came from somewhere, but it's very weird, particularly when because we meet his dad. Because we met his dad, didn't we, in series 2? Now I think, if I remember correct, I can't remember if I brought this up, so if anyone's listening who's recently listened to the series 2, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself or I'm completely contradicting what I'm about to say, but I think I might have brought up his twin brother, or at least alluded to the fact we will meet his twin brother, because I remember his twin brother. I completely forgot that we met his dad, and his dad, and I was quite surprised that his dad's normal, and isn't it a case that either Laura or Helen makes the joke saying, well, he's normal, so it's kind of, I find it kind of weird that you got two sons that are very, very similar, because I was about to say, like, I only just recently remember we saw his dad. I was about to make the point that, the dad they must get it from the dad, but we've seen the dad, so it's
well, so I would argue here that maybe it's because by this point, as the show has become fairly, entrenched as a favourite for people, you're into season 3, people know what this show is. I would say that Chris Barrie's performance now is starting to get to the point where it's becoming part of popular culture at the time in comedy circles. Yeah. And that's maybe why I think had they brought in the dad, maybe series 4, 5, he wouldn't have been like he was when we first met him. He would have been a lot more, I'm Mr. Brittas, that kind of thing. I think he would have been, because I think by then people understood Brittas as a particular comic archetype with a particular voice, with a particular tone and style and diction. And I think that's why Horatio isn't a normal bloke, because I think it's too much of a contrast to sort of say, okay, well, this guy's perfectly normal, so then Brittas isn't. You can maybe get away with that in the early days with the dad, but it does still stand out. When we watched it, we were like, that is weird. So I reckon that's why. That's why. But it's a slightly weird... I mean, it's an interesting plot because it's all about his brother essentially rediscovering his faith, really, and going back, and his brother is positioned as this sort of, almost like saintly ambassador to South America who's going off to do this, this really important work for the UN. And it's very odd. It is very odd as a plot line. Yeah.
But I always find that quite interesting. And I think this is the episode where I had my favourite. It might have been an earlier one, but I think it might be this one because it's the one when the centre burns down. And it's not the first. It's not going to be the last time it burns down. But there's a great little line, and I can't remember who said it, but it's like, it might have been Brittas himself saying, the members of the public outnumber the staff 3-1. I remember that actually made me chuckle quite a bit, because I think the gags about how many people don't go was actually quite limited. I think there's references to it, but there used to be a lot more jokes about the lack of people that went in the first couple of series. But episode 5 is Sex, Lies and Red Tape, where we meet Laura's estranged husband, Michael T. Farrell, after 2.5 years of splitting up. And this is mixed in with Brittas on a spot of silence, Helen being done for shoplifting, and Carol reading a novel. And this one sounds better on paper than it actually was.
Yeah, I agree. There's some good comic ideas here, but they wedge too many good comic ideas in one episode. The idea of Brittas doing a sponsored silence is very funny, and there's a few funny moments where he's got placards saying, can you just get on with it, or placards that basically read out things he would say like normally and go, can you get back to work, that kind of thing. And that's funny, right? That's funny. That should have been...
It's the stuff he constantly says.
Yeah, exactly. It's the stuff he constantly says. But that should have been, for me, You could have done a whole episode based around that, for one thing. And then Carol writing this great work of, like, literary brilliance everyone starts reading again is a great comic idea, because she's presented as such a, you know, some great, like, Harriet Thorpe moments where she's going to that in this one. Like, it's very good when he just beats her down with the cold hard reality, you know. Again, really funny stuff. But then you've got, I mean, the stuff with Laura and her husband was bizarre, and I don't mean bizarre in a way of like it being absurdist and interesting like some of the other stuff this season is. This just comes completely out of nowhere, almost, really. Except, you know, maybe it explains the fact she's got a weirdly big house, which is something that was mentioned in the other, a weirdly big garden anyway, because that's what actually Helen makes a reference to in the previous couple of episodes, where she says, you know, she lives in this little bungalow, but then you go into the back garden and it's like, it's huge. So, you know, maybe the fact she had like a multi-millionaire American, you know, company heir, you know, as a husband explains a bit of that, but it's odd. It's really odd, don't you think?
Yeah, because it ends up with this kind of like weird, kind of like almost dramatic scene where you've got this kind of like exaggerated American businessman who's going through all the stereotypes. Yeah. Like, it's basically the stereotypes that, for some bizarre reason, have lasted over 30 years. The same stereotypes.
Well, he's the American man that they would wheel out in all these kind of sitcoms. You know, this suave American handsome guy, you know, who sees all these quaint British people and they're doing some weird things. You know, it's like, it's that guy, isn't it?
Yeah, who just like gives him like £2,050 that he has in his wallet. Which, considering 2 episodes ago, a coffee in a coffee machine cost 20p.
I know.
I was like, blooming neck.
I know.
I saw that. I was like, wait, what? I rewound it and I went.
Yeah, I know. Crazy,
I was like, flipping neck.
Yeah,
man.
I suppose like this guy, if you want to look at it from an actual cultural context, he represents what at that time was this American prosperity that you would see in a lot of sitcoms, you know. Yeah. And the idea that the Americans are just, they're much more slick, they're much more suave, you know, they've got tons of money, you know, they think we're all strange little people living our quaint little lives. You know, he looks like he's just stepped off the set of Wall Street. You know, he has that kind of, there's a little bit of that Gordon Gekko about him. And it's like, well, like, I get it, but it would make sense if it was in a plot that, you know, if he was like an American millionaire who'd come to buy Whitbury Leisure Centre or something, you know, and it might be a bit of a cliche plot. And it's a very sort of old-fashioned 60s, 70s, maybe 80s sort of sitcom plot. But I'd understand it a bit more then. But he just wants to get Laura to bear his child. I mean, for one thing, why can't he just get any woman to do that? Like, why does it have to be her? Why does he have to travel to England? You know, he's got millions of pounds. He's going to find a woman who can have his baby. It's like, it was really bizarrely contrived. And then when she kisses Brittas, I was like, what the fucking hell is going on here? Like, that makes no sense, especially given how much she clearly values Helen's friendship, because they're friends. And she, you know, I was like, well, she wouldn't do that. She just would not have fundamentally done that, I don't think. It didn't ring true at all, even in a comedy setting.
Yeah, and I mean, there's just something weird about it, and I think there was something about, she snaps at him in the first series, because I remember us having a conversation about it, and I've been quite surprised that it was that early on there. She kind of takes him to task about it, but that's still a point where she still just barely knows him. Here they've been working for a few years now, and that outburst comes out of nowhere. That kind of kiss just comes out of nowhere either, and there's not really they don't really set up a will they won't they, because he's already married with Helen, and we've seen so many times throughout that he's devoted to his wife. He just has no idea what devoted means. So that's weird, and that was just weird, and yeah, I really don't know how to take that. It's just a very weird out of character choice that has nothing come back, doesn't really like pay much attention to the plot as well, apart from some weird kind of thing he says to Helen at the end. It says to Helen at the end or something, but yeah, it's just very weird.
Yeah,
and I think it kind of overshadows what could have been a bit more with Carol's kind of novel plot, because Harriet Thorpe, along with quite a lot of the supporting cast actually this series, don't really get that much to do or anything.
They get nothing. Colin gets a bit more. Colin gets a little bit more. There's a lot more references to the ants in his pants or the pulsating things coming out of his arse or what, all these gross things. Oh, Mr. Brittas, I've got sores on me backside and there's a lot more of that.
I've always remembered the bit where he says, "I've got a couple of wood lice at my ears." For some reason, that bit's always stuck with me.
Probably because it's gross, for one thing.
Yeah, because it's syringing his ears at work.
Yeah, wood lice. Oh, I've got this wood lice. And so there's a bit more of that because they're starting to really, really play into the idea that he's this, pus-ridden weirdo. So he gets a bit more in that sense. But yeah, it's such a wow. I mean, to be honest, am I that bothered if they've wasted Gavin, Tim, and what's the other one's name? I can't remember her name. Linda, right? Am I that bothered? No, because they're all right, but they're not necessarily great actors. Harriet Thorpe, though, you don't waste her. Like, Carol is legitimately the best character in this show outside of Brittas, easily, and she's the one that everyone remembers as well as Brittas if they think of this show. She's genuinely a great comic actor, and so you waste her at your peril. And I think that, and later seasons, I think, do correct that, don't they? But such a waste this year.
And I think there's a bit. Yeah, and I think there's a bit of kind of like, I think because you've had two kind of Laura episodes, but again, Julius and John isn't in a lot of the episodes. Well, no, she's in them, but there's like two episodes that focus her, and she suddenly like vanishes, and then suddenly has like about a good 5 minutes of screen time away from Brittas, and
I think it's because she's the straight character though, and part of the problem with the straight character is you have to have them in a situation where you've got people to bounce them off, and that's why when you've got the scenes with her and her husband, you're just sitting there thinking, why is the fucking point of this? Like, what's the point? Like, because it's not funny, it's not really funny, it's not, that he's not going to stick around, so it feels like just a waste, and I think that's maybe one of the reasons. I mean, partly why the show is able to carry on without her eventually as a character, because I don't think she's important in one sense, but in the other, this season they try and experiment with doing certain dramatic storylines around her, or at least storylines that make her more important. And there's a little bit of a sense that, why are we doing this when we could be having a whole episode with Carol writing a novel of genius that then starts getting bounced around different people? That's the great comedy episode. Why aren't we having an episode of Brittas not being able to speak for half an hour, and then at the end he explodes into madness? Why aren't we doing that? Like, so it feels like they're focusing on slightly the wrong things in a couple of, particularly this one, which is probably the worst. I would say this is probably the worst episode of the series, of this season. Yeah. Anyway.
It's definitely weak. And then we get to the last one, which is the Stuff of Dreams, which involves Brittas dressing up as an old man, and
this was really good, actually.
And Helen giving birth.
I'm 72 years old, and I need to know that the facilities are.
I want to do the hyperactive, like, was it the aerobics class or something you want to do?
Are you saying because I'm 72 years old, I'm not allowed to take part in these facilities? So it's really funny. He's really good, I think, Chris Barrie, in that. And that's a good example of how you totally could have had him play his twin brother, and do it slightly differently, And you put him in that latex and you give him that. He nails that completely. He's really good.
Yeah, I think it was, but it then leads to him like kind of caring for his thoughts of the elderly and the man he breaks the glasses of and stuff. And it's particularly what's interesting with this. I think it claps a series that what I find quite interesting is that Brittas has this dream of influencing people and wanting to kind of be a leader or a mentor, and there's like an episode where he tries to do that, where he interviews that young teenage girl in the previous season as like a potential kind of mentee to carry on the dream that he has. This dream which he's brought up with his his brother at one point. But what I find quite interesting is this episode, the episode with the Guildford branch or the Guildford lot, and even the first episode is that there are people who are susceptible to and do find some kind of influence and react positively to Brittas.
Yeah, no, there are. Yeah.
So for example, the whole thing with in the trial is that he actually has an impact on Billy Mitchell, whose character's name I can't remember, who actually comes in and goes, this man's right. I did those things. I need to go to prison, but because he's right, he told me the way. I won a squash competition, but not actually playing any squash.
That's funny.
Yeah.
You've had a bye all the way to the final. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and just didn't have to play the final either. But then like you got the Guildford lot who just get to a point where like they find him fascinating to the point where it's fun, and that has a knock-on impact about his brother. And here, he actually the old man he breaks his glasses of somehow isn't affronted or offended by him posing as an old man, but sees it. Oh, hang on, this man actually wants to highlight the plight of old people by dressing up and appropriating old people, and actually isn't antagonistic when he appears again later on. Whereas previous sitcom, if this was Fawlty Towers, it'd probably be someone who Basil pissed off, and in parking in front of the car will probably just be someone that Basil pissed off, and then that person would have just walked off out of spite. For characters like Basil Fawlty or David Brent or anything like that. Here it's a case that I think it's slightly funnier, where it's someone who actually assimilated and recognises what Brittas is trying to do, but then the error is that he's blocking the cars because of accidents and just like sitcom kind of issues.
But it's his technical. He cannot not do things by the book. So when that accident happens, he has to, even though Helen's about to give birth, he has to get out. And we must get the insurance stuff, my darling. You know, that kind of thing. Yeah. He has to do that. The different, and that's interesting. You make a really good point here, because that is the difference between Brittas and Basil Fawlty. Much as this show, on a structural basis, often does ape Fawlty Towers and other sitcoms of that ilk. The difference between Basil and Brittas is that Basil hated where he was and was desperate to escape, and he never could. And the comedy came out of his bitterness and his anger and his feeling of complete lack of self-worth, all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. That was what was funny. And it's whereas with Brittas, and this is maybe where Brittas leans a little bit more to the David Brent, less tragic, but that kind of thing, is that Brittas is exactly where he wants to be. This is his world. He loves it here. He wants to be the best. He wants to show all his staff all of the great things he wants to do. And there's the scene in Two Little Boys with Horatio, where Horatio's saying, "Didn't you ever want to go and do this, or didn't you ever want to be that?" And he's like, "No." Yeah. No. And he's like, and he has no conception of anything beyond, there's the reason it's called the Brittas Empire. It is partly a play on the British Empire, sure.
Yeah.
But there is a reason it's called the Brittas Empire, is because he is building his own little empire and his own little world of rules and systems, and in that technocratic way, which on the one hand drives people bonkers and up the wall because he has no room for manoeuvre, but on the other, there is a level where if he changed his style a little bit, he could be genuinely inspiring. But on the other, but often doesn't work like that. I mean, the one thing that really struck out to me that would never have got through in this day and age was the episode where he's basically been filming them all getting changed as a means of trying to improve their bodies. And then he gives them dossiers with them all half naked, having spied on them with a camera, and then says, "This is your folder that will get you to a peak performance and peak health." And I was sitting there watching it, going, "Fuck me!"
I forgot about
arrested
that. Now, I was like, okay. And again, I don't think it's one of those weird things where they kind of misjudge the character. I think he means well, but I don't. Yeah, I don't know, he means well, but does it in the wrong way. But I think that's slightly too far to what the character is. I think the whole thing with his individual figure and fitness targets that he gives people, I think that's perfectly in character because it's that's perfectly in character.
He slightly would do that.
But I know what you mean. It's the camera. It's the camera in the.
I mean,
it would
get him arrested. Really, it should have gotten him arrested then. You know, you'd like to think the law in 1993 would still have got him arrested. However, nowadays that would never even get written or made because it's just such a skeevy idea now, and you've had so many things happen with this. And there is also the level of fat shaming and stuff he does. I mean, there's that girl who's one of the employees, sort of a non-speaking role, and he completely fat shames her because he's talking about look at that on, and it's those kind of things now that you look at, and they're not funny. And in the way that they would have been funny to an audience in 1993, and that's, but to be fair to Brittas, it doesn't have a lot of that. It doesn't have a lot of that comedy where, and there's all these kind of debates flowing around, and they fly around about Fawlty Towers, don't they? But debates about you can't show that now, or that's too dated. No, I don't believe any of that. I think show it as it always was, and then people will make their own mind up, and then you put the contextual information around it. But Brittas doesn't really have much of that. Like, it's actually quite timeless for the most part. I think it's quite and I think that's because it's so surrealist and so oddball quite often that it can remain fairly timeless. And so there aren't. I didn't find many examples like this one we've just talked about where you look back and you go, "Oh, blimey, that was very 1993." It escapes that really.
The only other thing I think. Is the first series where he where he thinks because Tim's gay he might be perving on everyone. Yeah. That's the only other thing I can think of that kind of goes to the level of maybe a bit too far that I think that goes beyond what I think Brittas as a character should be like, or could be solved with a slight rewrite.
Yes.
I think this probably that's probably the same as well, because I think for the most part, I think Brittas is harmless but misguided. And again, the comparison to Brent, where I think Brent he doesn't know how to control mean-spiritedness, whereas Brittas I think should, or at least there's no or he's completely devoid of any mean-spiritedness. So anything that can be taken as a negative comment from him, in his mind, it's not negative. Whereas again, Basil Fawlty will just just slap his employees. Slap Manuel anyway.
Exactly. I think now from a modern vantage point, you could make an argument that Brittas is extremely on the spectrum. And I think you could probably diagnose him with with some kind of maybe even some sort of Asperger's, because he has absolutely no comprehension of what people are feeling, really, in a way. He is completely shut off from the reality of that, and he sees things through a very specific prism, whereas Brent was obsessed with what people were thinking and feeling, and that was why he did everything he did, because it was all about his own validation. I don't think that's what it is with Brittas. He doesn't need validation from anyone, because he's convinced that everyone should be like him or should be following his mindset and his rule book, and that's where the comedy comes from. Because we can sit back and go, he's mad. Like, his rules and regulations are nuts. Like, and the things he suggested are crazy. But that's what makes him funny. But I absolutely think that there is a level of emotional intelligence with Brittas that he's completely missing on one level. He cares about people, but it's very much through his own prism, really. And I think that's really interesting in retrospectively for the character, I think.
I think that's definitely got a point there in terms of what Brittas might be seen as in this day and age. And as I'm conscious of time, I'm not going to get too much into it, but perhaps something that we can probably talk about in a future episode is like if we start comparing him to perhaps characters like Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory.
That would be good.
Or even at the moment, I am currently rewatching The Bridge, the original Danish-Swedish show, and the character of Saga Naren, who's kind of like almost undiagnosed like Asperger's like syndrome is like very much like one of the key explorations of the show as well.
I tell you what, right? It is interesting. I tell you what, I challenge anyone to find a connection between the Brittas Empire and the bridge anywhere else on the internet. I think that has got to be a first. I tell you.
I tell you, if Gordon Brittas was on that team, it lasts 3 episodes.
You're right, though. It would be worth more of a chat. Maybe we'll get into that later in another episode.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting line to go through. But I think as we're gearing up to time, and we don't want to spend 3 hours talking about the Brittas Empire season 3. I think we are here at the end. I think we've reached the end of our chat, and like with now 3 out of 7.
Yeah,
3 for 7. So
I did enjoy this series more than I have yet any of the others. I think this is so far the strongest series. It's getting better each time we do this in terms of the quality of the comedy. So hopefully, fingers crossed, season 4 is gonna be even better. So I'm looking forward to that when we come back and talk about that in the year 2460. I think we've got that down for.
Yeah, and you'll still reschedule it. But I think particularly this series and this series and series 4, from what I remember, is probably going to be the peak of it. Right, it's going to be the peak of its creativity, I think. But I think series 5, 6, and 7 are going to be more interesting to talk about. From what from my memory, I might be completely misremembering what happens in those series, but I think we're reaching an interesting point in Brittas Empire, and then we're going to get even more interesting as we get to series 5 and onwards. But yeah, so that's it. So Tony, if people want to find you on the internet, where can they find you and your podcasty stuff?
Oh, blimey. Well, this is probably going to take 3 hours. No, I'll shorten it down. We've got, with me on, loads of different podcasts on the We Made This Podcast Network, at wemadethisnetwork.com. And you can find me with more lists of my podcasts and my writing and things like that at culturalconversation.co.uk. And on Twitter, if you want to come and chat and hang out and see what I'm up to, at AJ Black Writers. Those are the best places to get me, and you'll find all the links to everything else I do, really.
Yeah, and if you want to find me, you can find me on the other episodes of Shipwrecks and Comatose and the podcast Piccadilly, where I talk about music, blah 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 blah. If you listen to this, you've heard me say all that stuff before. So
they wake up in the middle of the night reciting it, I think, don't they?
Yes. You go to pick a disc, like someone picks a disc for whatever reason they want to. It's like, honey, you're talking to it again. Goes like, honey, you muttering the Latham limit in your sleep again.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, if you've listened to us before, you probably know where to find me. You probably know where to find me in the other podcasts. I'm not going to.
You know where to avoid him, so you know.
Yes.
You don't need to be reminded again.
Yes, but other than that, I'm going to head off to a rival leisure centre to basically do a kind of like a bingo on their manager. So I'm going to be saying goodbye, Tony.
Sounds excellent. It's getting worse.
Yeah, that's like Cockney gangster Brits.
It was, wasn't it? It was. No, cheers.
What do you say, Carol?
You slag.
It's
been a lot of fun. I'm really enjoying this. Yeah, roll on season 4. So yeah, we'll reconvene then. Nice one.
Yep, and take care.
Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast, was created and produced by Mark Adams and Kurt North. You can find us on Twitter at Red Dwarf Pod, and we are part of the We Made This Podcast Network, which can be found online at wemadethispod.com or on Twitter at wemadethispod.
Elsewhere on We Made This.
Giddy carousel of pop.
By 1989, I'd actually landed a job working at a fashion PR agency called Lynn Franks PR. This particular issue is memorable to me because it was our first smash hits cover for our client, Nana Cherry. They never told you if you'd get a cover or not. There'd always be this kind of cat and mouse. Well, we'll look at it as a great feature and we'll have to have our own shoot and we'll have to do this, and then there's quite a long period of negotiation and you never really knew if you got the cover until it came out. And I remember, when you go down and see it on the newsstand, it was a fantastic feeling. It just felt like, this is my sort of golden extra time to win the FA Cup moment.
Chucky Vision, a Chucky podcast.
The introduction, the editorial, if you will, was written by David Campetti, and it shows real love and isn't shy about having a dig at cheap-ass, lazy film adaptations.
Yeah, Campetti is an interesting one as the co-founder of Innovation and also the editor. Yeah, a lot of his editorials are hawking other merch, hawking, the different books and stuff they're putting out, but it never felt too corporate. He has a passion in his voice that he very much is enthusiastic and enjoys that they're getting to adapt these franchises.
It does seem like he's definitely acquired Chucky because he's a fan.
Red and Berry podcast.
The theme this month was an Anne Rule book, so true crime, but not The Stranger Beside Me, which is her big book that broke the world of true crime fiction, non-fiction. True crime fiction, I just said, that's not a sentence.
Yeah.
He fell in love.
Oh.
He's so in love, but still not in love enough to stop using sex workers.
Yeah.
But in love enough to not murder them. So...
Okay.
He's a romantic, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, what a man.
What a dreamy man.
But his actual name was Robert Knickerbocker.
Wow.
Which is like the best surname ever.
Do you think maybe she thought no one's going to believe this is a real name?
Well, yeah, that could have been it.
If I'm wrong, please don't correct me. I don't want to know. I want to know I'm right. Thank you.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.